Have you ever felt it? That sharp, invisible wound, not on your skin but deep inside your chest. A sudden weight you didn't see coming. A hollow space where trust used to live. They smiled. They spoke softly. They promised. And then they turned away. Betrayal. It hits you in a place no one else can see, but you feel it in every breath, every heartbeat. And the worst part isn't always what they did, it's what it left behind in you. The questions. The broken stories, the ache of wondering why. You see, in our lives, we prepare for many kinds of pain. We know bones can break, hearts can ache, and time can wear us down. But betrayal, that's a wound most of us never expect. It's not just the loss of a person, it's the death of a belief. The belief that this one thing, this one person was safe. And when that falls apart, it shakes the entire architecture of our world. Because betrayal is personal. It says, you were wrong to trust. And suddenly, every conversation, every shared memory, every promise feels like a lie. It's not just what they did, it's what you thought you knew. But what if I told you that betrayal has existed in every human heart in every age, even in the time of the Buddha? One of the Buddha's closest disciples, Devadatta, tried to take his life, not once but several times. He plotted, he deceived, he sought power over compassion. Imagine that. A man who walked beside the enlightened one, who heard the same teachings of wisdom and kindness, yet his heart turned to darkness. If betrayal could reach even the Buddha, how could it not find us? Yet in Buddhism, this isn't a tragedy to avoid at all costs. It's a mirror, a sharp, clear reflection of what happens when attachment and expectation grow unchecked. The Buddha taught that suffering, in all its forms, comes from craving, from clinging, from the illusion that things and people will always be the way we want them to be. We hold onto relationships like delicate glass, believing they'll stay whole if we care enough, if we try hard enough. But life doesn't work that way. People change, feelings fade, promises break. And the truth is, sometimes the person who hurts you isn't evil or cruel or monstrous. They're simply human, lost in their own maze of desires, fears, and ignorance. And when we understand this, something remarkable happens. The wound remains, but it stops festering. The pain still visits, but it no longer owns us. You see, the heart's natural response to betrayal is to shut down, to harden, to build walls and swear, never again. But what if that isn't protection? What if that's another kind of prison? Buddhist wisdom doesn't ask us to deny our pain or pretend we're not hurt. It invites us to sit with it, to look at it, to see betrayal not as an ending but as a beginning, a doorway. Because in every moment of betrayal, there lies a hidden opportunity, not to forget, not to excuse, but to awaken, to realize that no one controls your peace but you, that no one holds your freedom hostage unless you hand them the key. It's not easy. God, no. It's one of the hardest things you'll ever do. But there's a reason the Buddha called this path the middle way. Not because it avoids pain, but because it walks through it, eyes open, heart steady. So, what are you supposed to do with this invisible wound? This aching silence inside you? You begin by understanding why it hurts so deeply. Not because of what they did, but because of what you believed, because of the story you told yourself. They'll always choose me, they'll never leave, they'll never lie. And when reality doesn't match the story, it shatters. And it feels like you shatter with it. But here's something to hold on to. The Buddha didn't promise a life without pain. He promised a path through it. A way to let go of the craving that chains us to suffering. A way to see clearly. To understand the nature of things and people as they truly are. Impermanent, imperfect, and ever-changing. It doesn't mean you'll never be hurt again, but it means you'll suffer less. And isn't that what we're all searching for? Not a perfect, painless life, but a wise, open-hearted one. So if you've ever carried this wound, if you're carrying it now, you are not alone. You walk a road every wise person before you has traveled. And in the very space where trust was broken, you can plant a deeper peace than you ever thought possible. A peace that no one can betray. And as we journey forward, let's begin to unravel how Buddhism explains the true roots of suffering and betrayal. not just the act, but the hidden forces beneath it. Because once you see them clearly, you can finally begin to loosen their grip. And that is where the healing begins. So here we are, standing in the rubble of what was, looking at the pieces of trust scattered like glass on a cold, hard floor. And the question comes almost like a whisper: why does it hurt so much? Why do we suffer so deeply when someone betrays us? You might think it's obvious, because it's wrong, because it's cruel, because no one deserves it. But Buddhism asks us to look beyond the surface, to trace the pain not just to the action but to the roots hidden beneath. And those roots, they live inside us. The Buddha in his wisdom taught that all suffering, every heartbreak, every disappointment, every betrayal stems from three poisons. Three forces that live in every human heart: craving, aversion, and ignorance. Let's unravel them one by one. The first is craving, tanha in Pali. It's the thirst for things to be a certain way. The craving for permanence in a world that refuses to stand still. When you trust someone, when you love them, when you believe in them, craving sneaks in and whispers, "They will always stay. They will always be loyal. They will never hurt me." And when they don't, the craving turns into suffering, not because betrayal happened, but because it didn't match the script we clung to. It's like gripping sand too tightly in your hand. The harder you hold, the more it slips away. The second is aversion, the instinct to push away what we don't like. When betrayal strikes, aversion flares like wildfire. We want to erase them, punish them, erase the memory, escape the pain. But aversion, like craving, is a trap. It binds us to what we reject. The more you resist your hurt, the tighter it wraps around your heart. And then comes the third poison: ignorance. Not stupidity, not a lack of intelligence, but a deep misunderstanding of how the world really works. Ignorance makes us believe people should act the way we expect. That good people never hurt you. That love is permanent. That trust is unbreakable. But Buddhism teaches us something radically different. That everything, every person, every relationship, every emotion is impermanent. Nothing lasts. Not even betrayal. Not even the person you were before it happened. It sounds harsh at first, almost cruel, but there's a quiet mercy in it. Because when you stop expecting the world to be something it is, you stop suffering quite so much. Imagine standing in the middle of a storm, the wind howling, the rain lashing. You can curse it, resist it, scream at the sky. Or you can recognize this is the nature of storms, and like all things, it will pass. Betrayal is a storm in the heart, and understanding its nature is the first step toward peace. The Buddha never promised that people wouldn't disappoint us. Even his closest disciples faltered. What he offered was a way to understand our suffering, to see that it's not the betrayal itself, but our attachment to what we thought should be. And here's something no one tells you. Sometimes, it's not even the person you miss. It's the version of yourself you were when you believed in them. Buddhist wisdom gently invites us to grieve that too, to mourn not just the trust broken but the innocence lost, and then to let it go, not to deny it, not to forget it, but to stop carrying it like a chain around your neck. Because here's a truth worth holding on to. You cannot stop people from betraying you, but you can stop betraying yourself by clinging to what's already gone. That is the quiet, unshakable freedom the Buddha spoke of. Not a life without pain, but a heart untouched by the poisons of craving, aversion, and ignorance. It doesn't mean you'll stop hurting overnight. It means you'll stop drowning in it. And as you rise from that pain, breath by breath, you begin to see betrayal for what it truly is: a teacher in disguise. A brutal, unwelcome, relentless teacher, but a teacher nonetheless, because it reveals where you've been clinging, where you've been blind, where your peace was dependent on something or someone outside of you. And when you see it, you can begin to loosen your grip. And in that loosening, a new kind of strength is born. So the next time your heart cracks open under the weight of betrayal, remember this: the pain is real, but the suffering, that you have a choice in. And the first step to making that choice is seeing the truth of how suffering works. As we journey deeper, Let's step closer to that truth. Let's explore how the Buddha faced betrayal in his own life, and what his example teaches us about meeting our own pain without hatred. Because there's a wisdom in his story that can save us from drowning in ours. There's a moment, quiet, almost unnoticeable, that comes after the storm, when the shouting inside your head softens, when the memories stop ambushing you every time you blink, when the ache in your chest, though still there, isn't the sharp, breath-stealing pain it once was. And in that moment, you ask yourself, now what? Buddhism doesn't offer quick fixes. It won't hand you a 3-step plan to mend your heart overnight. What it offers is something quieter and far more enduring. A path, a way of meeting your pain without letting it own you. And at the center of that path is mindfulness. Now, what is mindfulness really? It's a word we hear everywhere these days, often reduced to apps and breathing exercises. But in the heart of Buddhist teaching, mindfulness, or sati in Pali, is so much more than that. It's the practice of seeing clearly, of turning your gaze inward, not to judge, not to suppress, but simply to witness. When betrayal strikes, our instinct is to either drown in the pain or run from it. We replay the moment it happened. We imagine different outcomes, we wish it away, or we bury it so deep that it festers in the dark. But mindfulness invites a different response. It says, stay. Look, see what's here. It's not easy. The mind will rebel. The heart will beg for distraction. But if you can sit, even for a few breaths, in the rawness of your pain, something unexpected happens. You begin to notice what the Buddha noticed under the Bodhi tree, that all things rise and fall. That no thought, no emotion, no sensation stays forever. The anger that felt like fire, it flickers. The sorrow that clung to your bones, it softens. The fear that made you small, it too dissolves. Not because you forced it to, but because that is the nature of all things. And when you see this for yourself, not as philosophy, but as lived experience, betrayal loses some of its grip on you. Mindfulness doesn't mean you pretend it didn't happen. It doesn't mean you forgive too soon or suppress your grief. It means you meet each moment exactly as it is, without adding extra layers of story to it. You feel the tightness in your chest and say, this is tightness. You notice the thought, I'll never trust anyone again, and label it as a thought arising. You hear the memory knocking at your mind's door and acknowledge it as a memory passing through. In doing so, you stop becoming your pain and start witnessing it. And there's a power in that, a quiet authority that says, yes, this hurts, but I am more than this hurt. The Buddha compared the human mind to a monkey, swinging wildly from branch to branch, thought to thought. Mindfulness is how we climb down from the branches, how we plant our feet on solid ground again. And here's the truth no one tells you. You don't have to do this perfectly. You don't have to sit like a saint, untouched by grief. Even noticing that you've been swept away by a painful thought is a moment of awakening. Each time you remember to come back to your breath, to your body, to this very moment, you reclaim a little more of yourself from the ruins of betrayal. One breath at a time, one heartbeat at a time, over and over. Because healing isn't a straight line, it's a spiral. Some days you'll feel strong, untouchable. Other days, the smallest thing will send you crumbling. That's okay. The practice isn't about never falling. It's about remembering you can rise again. And slowly, as you walk this path of mindfulness, you start to see betrayal not just as something that was done to you, but as something that's moving through you. A passing storm, a chapter, not your whole story. And in that space between reaction and response, freedom lives. So if your heart is still tender, if the wound is still raw, start here. Notice one breath. Feel your feet against the ground. Let a tear fall without shame. Say to yourself, this too belongs. Because every moment of mindful awareness is a thread in the tapestry of your healing. And soon, without you forcing it, those threads begin to weave something new. Not the life you had before, but a life stitched with wisdom, softness, and the quiet strength of one who has looked their pain in the eye and lived to tell the story. And isn't that, in the end, a kind of victory? As we continue, let's explore how forgiveness fits into this picture, not as a duty, but as a path toward reclaiming your own peace. Because forgiveness, in Buddhist teaching, isn't something you give to others. It's something you gift yourself. And the way toward it begins where you are right now. There's a moment in every wound when anger feels like the only thing keeping you standing. It burns hot, fierce, righteous. It tells you you're still alive. It makes you believe for a little while that hatred is strength. After betrayal, hatred whispers seductive things. They don't deserve your kindness. If you let this go, you'll look weak. Hold on to this. It's the only power you have left. And it's easy to believe, because anger feels sharper than grief, more solid than emptiness. It fills the space where trust used to be. But here's the truth the Buddha uncovered, a truth that countless practitioners have sat with under trees, beside rivers, and in the quiet corners of their hearts. Hatred does not protect us. It poisons us, not in some abstract, moralizing way, but physically, emotionally, spiritually. Each time you replay their betrayal in your mind, each time you feed that story of how awful they are, you're drinking from a cup laced with bitterness. And it doesn't touch them. It only corrodes you. Buddhist wisdom doesn't ask you to deny your anger. It doesn't shame you for feeling it. In fact, it teaches that anger is natural, a part of being human. But it also teaches that anger is a visitor, not a home. It comes. It stays for a time. And if you don't feed it, it leaves. The question is, what do you do while it's here? This is where compassion enters the story. Not the soft, sentimental kind we see in greeting cards, but a fierce, grounded compassion. The kind forged in suffering. The kind that says, I refuse to let your actions make me cruel. Compassion in Buddhism isn't about excusing harm. It's not about pretending the betrayal didn't happen or rushing to forgive before you're ready. It's about seeing clearly, recognizing that those who betray often act from their own blindness, their own wounds, their own desperate attempts to escape suffering. It's about understanding that cruelty is a symptom of ignorance. And when you see this, something shifts. You realize you don't have to carry their darkness inside you. You don't have to let their choices dictate your peace. The Buddha told a story about a man who was shot with an arrow. Instead of seeking treatment, the man insisted on knowing who shot him, what their caste was, what kind of wood the arrow was made from. And while he obsessed over these questions, his wound worsened. The message is clear. Don't waste your precious life nursing resentment. Don't let hatred turn you into a mirror of the very thing that hurt you. Compassion is not for them. It's for you. It's a balm you apply to your own heart, a shield against the corrosion of bitterness, and with time it transforms. Anger softens. Wisdom grows in its place. And here's the deeper truth. In compassion, you reclaim your power. Not the power to control what others do, but the power to choose how you respond. The power to heal, to learn, to rise. And strangely, as you cultivate compassion for those who hurt you, not to excuse, but to understand, you begin to see your own suffering differently too. You realize how often you've betrayed yourself, how you've spoken harshly to your own mind, how you've abandoned your own tenderness in the name of toughness. Compassion then becomes not just a practice toward others, but toward yourself. A softening around your own mistakes, a willingness to see your own wounds clearly without judgment. And in that softening, wisdom blooms. You begin to recognize the patterns, to see the restless hunger that drives people to harm, to spot the illusions you once clung to, believing them to be truths. This is how hatred transforms into wisdom, not by suppressing it, not by pretending it's not there, but by holding it in the light of awareness, letting it show you where you're still trapped. And as you learn to meet both your own pain and the ignorance of others with fierce, clear compassion, you step into a freedom the world cannot touch. A freedom that says, I will not be ruled by what was done to me. And isn't that, in the end, the truest kind of victory? As we continue this path together, let's turn now to a practice that anchors all of this. A way to steady yourself when the old anger surges, when memories pull you under, when the ache feels too much. A simple, ancient practice that saved countless hearts across centuries, the art of loving-kindness meditation. It's here that the healing deepens. It's here that you begin to rewrite the story inside your own chest. And it begins with a single breath. When we're betrayed, the world shrinks. Our attention narrows to a single point of pain. It's like being locked in a dim room, endlessly replaying that one moment, the lie, the broken promise, the silence that hurt more than words. It feels personal, targeted, unforgivable. But what if it is? What if the betrayal that shattered your trust wasn't really about you at all? This is where Buddhist wisdom offers a doorway. A way to step beyond the small, suffocating story of me and them. A way to see the bigger picture. And at the heart of this perspective lies one of the Buddha's most profound teachings, dependent origination. At first glance, it might sound abstract, even philosophical, but in truth, it's deeply practical. It's a lens that reveals how suffering isn't random, nor is it isolated. It's part of a web, a chain of causes and conditions stretching back beyond what the eye can see. Nothing happens in isolation. Nothing arises without a cause. And every action, every word, every moment of betrayal is the result of countless factors converging. Think about it. The person who hurt you, were they born cruel? Or did their choices grow from their own pain, their own ignorance, their unmet needs, their forgotten wounds? Maybe they were shaped by their upbringing, the way they were spoken to as a child, the betrayals they themselves endured, the fears they've never confessed. It doesn't excuse what they did, but it reveals this vital truth. People act from causes and conditions, not from some fixed, evil essence. And when you see that, you realize the betrayal wasn't a solitary act aimed solely at you. It was the latest ripple in a vast, tangled ocean of human suffering. The anger they inflicted on you was likely born of the anger someone else inflicted on them. An ancient chain passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, heart to heart. And here's the most important part. You have the power to break that chain by refusing to add another link of hatred, by choosing awareness over blind reaction, by responding not with revenge but with wisdom. Dependent origination teaches that suffering arises from ignorance, from not seeing things as they truly are. We cling, we crave, we push away. We tell ourselves stories of permanence in a world made of constant change. Betrayal hurts so deeply because it shatters the illusion of security we built around another person. We believed they'd always be loyal, that they'd never falter, and when they did, the ground beneath us crumbled. But the truth is, people change. Circumstances shift. Attachment, if held too tightly, will always carry the seed of suffering. Through this lens, betrayal is no longer just a personal attack. It becomes a symptom of a deeper, universal condition, the human tendency to grasp at what cannot be controlled. When you see this, your pain begins to soften, not because it vanishes, but because it finds its rightful place in the vast, intricate tapestry of life. You realize you're not alone, that across centuries and continents, countless others have felt this same ache, that even the Buddha himself, before his awakening, knew betrayal. And in that recognition, a strange kind of peace emerges. Because if everything arises from causes and conditions, then so too can healing. So too can wisdom. So too can the choice to live differently. The Buddha described this process as breaking the wheel of samsara, the endless cycle of suffering driven by ignorance and craving. And you, right now, hold the capacity to pause that wheel, to look at your pain not as a curse but as a teacher, to ask, what patterns brought me here? What patterns am I tempted to repeat? And how might I step off this endless, weary path? This isn't about spiritual bypassing. It's not about minimizing harm or pretending you weren't wounded. It's about understanding the architecture of suffering so you can stop adding bricks to the wall around your heart. Imagine this. Each time you feel the old anger rise, you pause, you breathe, you remind yourself, this is a moment conditioned by countless causes. I don't have to be another one. And in that breath, you break the chain. Dependent origination is not just a teaching for monks in distant monasteries. It's a lifeline for those of us navigating the messy, painful beauty of human relationships. It's a reminder that while you cannot always control what happens to you, you can always choose what happens next. And sometimes, seeing the bigger picture is the very thing that shrinks our suffering. Not because the pain disappears, but because it no longer defines the entire story. It becomes a chapter, not the whole book. And in the quiet between the lines, you might discover that the betrayal that once felt like an ending was actually an invitation. An invitation to wake up, to see clearly, to live differently. And speaking of invitations, as we move forward, there's a practice rooted in ancient wisdom that helps train the heart and mind to respond this way, not just in thought, but in action. A practice that turns awareness into courage. And that's exactly where we'll go next. There's a moment after betrayal when you feel stripped bare, like a house with its doors torn from the hinges. The winds of memory, anger, and fear rush in uninvited, and you wonder, how will I ever feel safe again? Some people respond by building walls, thick, cold, impenetrable. They vow never to trust, never to open, never to care. Others leave the doors wide open, hoping if they're endlessly kind, endlessly forgiving, no one will hurt them again. But neither approach heals the wound. One suffocates the heart, the other leaves it exposed. What the Buddha taught, and what life gently reveals when we're willing to listen, is that wisdom isn't about isolation or blind forgiveness. It's about awareness. It's about learning to rebuild boundaries, not out of fear, not out of bitterness, but out of understanding. Because you see, a boundary isn't a wall, it's a bridge, a conscious line that says, this is where I end and you begin. This is what I will accept, and this is what I will not. It's not about punishment. It's about clarity. Betrayal often happens because those boundaries were blurred by our own hopes, by unspoken expectations, or by the clever manipulations of others. And when we don't know where we stand, we can't see when someone crosses a line. So rebuilding begins with seeing yourself clearly, with asking, what do I value? What matters to me? What am I no longer willing to compromise for temporary peace? This is where wound turns into wisdom. In Buddhist teaching, this process is called sati, mindfulness. Not merely being aware of the present moment, but being intimate with the nature of your own heart. When you notice how certain words tighten your chest, when you feel how some presences lift you up while others deplete you, when you witness the quiet ache of loneliness when you ignore your own needs, this isn't self-centeredness, it's self-respect. In the Buddha's time, monks carried a simple bowl. They ate only what was offered, no more, no less. The bowl was a symbol of sufficiency, knowing what you can hold and knowing when to say enough. Your boundaries are like that bowl. They aren't there to shut out the world. They're there to hold what nourishes you and let go of what poisons you. And here's something most people forget. Forgiveness doesn't mean letting someone back into your life. It means releasing yourself from the weight of resentment. You can forgive a person, wish them peace on their path, and still choose to close the door behind them. That's wisdom, that's awakening. The Dalai Lama once said, "Be kind whenever possible, it is always possible." But kindness isn't naivety. It's fierce, it's discerning, and sometimes it looks like saying, "I love you, and I can no longer walk this road with you." Rebuilding boundaries with awareness means listening to the messages betrayal left behind, not the messages of anger, but the deeper ones. Where was I ignoring my own intuition? Where did I trade honesty for harmony? Where did I cling because I was afraid to be alone? And then making a vow, not to be harder but to be clearer, to meet new people not with suspicion, but with the steady wisdom of one who has walked through fire and remembers the shape of the flame. Because here's the truth, every wound is an opening, a place where light can get in if you let it. And when you start living this way, you no longer fear betrayal, not because it won't happen, but because you trust yourself to meet it differently, to feel the pain without drowning in it, to respond without losing your dignity, to walk away without closing your heart. And perhaps the greatest boundary of all is this: the refusal to let anyone else's darkness dictate the way you shine. In Buddhist practice, this is called virya, energy, effort, the unshakable commitment to keep walking the path of wisdom no matter how many times you fall. Not for perfection, not for applause, but because your peace is worth it. And as you do this, you'll notice something. The people around you will change. Some will fall away. Others will rise to meet your clarity. And in time, you'll find yourself surrounded not by those who never make mistakes, but by those who honor your boundaries, respect your heart, and walk beside you without chains. That, my friend, is how the wound becomes wisdom. Not overnight, not without ache, but in steady, honest steps. And if you've come this far, you're already on that road. Now, as we prepare to bring this journey home, there's one final piece. A truth so often misunderstood, yet perhaps the most powerful teaching of all. It's the wisdom of impermanence. The knowing that all things, even betrayal, even heartache, even anger, are temporary visitors in the house of your life. And if you're ready, that's where we'll go next. So here we are, at the edge of a story that was never just about betrayal, but about awakening. Because if you've truly listened, not just with your ears, but with the quiet spaces of your heart, you've realized something. Betrayal isn't the enemy. It's the mirror, the unexpected teacher, the ruthless sculptor shaping you into someone who no longer seeks their worth in other people's hands. And maybe that's what it was always meant to be. The Buddha taught that suffering is inevitable, but clinging to it is a choice. Pain is a part of life, but the endless replay, the silent punishment, the hardening of your heart, those are the chains we place upon ourselves. The great freedom lies not in forgetting the wound, but in no longer letting it define you. To let it become part of your story, not the title. And what's astonishing is this: when you release the bitterness, the need for justice, the ache for apologies that may never come, you become light, not because the world has changed, but because you have. You begin to see betrayal not as the shattering of your world, but as the clearing of what was never truly meant to stay. And in that clearing, something extraordinary happens. There's space for new joys, for unexpected kindnesses, for deeper relationships built not on illusion, but on truth. This is the wisdom of impermanence the Buddha spoke of, that no matter how dark a night may feel, it passes. That no matter how deeply you've been hurt, healing waits quietly, like dawn behind the mountains. And that no matter how betrayed you've been, you are not broken, you are vast, you are whole, and you are free. This freedom isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks or fanfare. It arrives in quiet moments. When you wake up one morning and realize the person who hurt you no longer controls the temperature of your day. When you hear their name and feel nothing. When you stand before a new soul and instead of fearing betrayal, you trust yourself to survive it. That, my friend, is the freedom beyond betrayal. A freedom born not from forgetting, but from transcending. And if you remember nothing else from this journey, let it be this: no one has the power to steal your peace, not unless you hand it to them. The wound was real, the pain was sharp, but it was never meant to be a prison. It was a passage, and you, beautiful, bruised, unbroken you walked through it. So take a breath, not a breath of forgetting, but a breath of becoming. You have not just survived betrayal. You have met it, sat with it, listened to it, and risen wiser for its visit. And now you carry within you the most precious thing of all, a heart that knows it cannot be destroyed. The Buddha smiled not because life was easy, but because he understood its nature. So smile, not for them, but for yourself, because you made it. And this peace, this clarity, this quiet strength, no one can ever take from you again. The wound was the doorway, and you, my friend, have walked through.